Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Stephanie Voice, and I'm the manager for placemaking, cleanliness, and transportation at the Downtown Winnipeg BIZ. On behalf of the BIZ's 1,300 members, our board, and we have our chair, Debbie O'Bray, in the audience, Satchit Mehra, and Wes Schoenberg representing our board. And our staff, I am honored to welcome and introduce our esteemed panel tonight. Our moderator, Bartley Keys, and our guest speaker, Tim Tompkins, president of the Times Square Alliance. Before I begin, I'd like to give a special thank you to our fantastic host, the Fairmont Winnipeg, of course, and of course our BIZ members who provide us with the capacity and opportunity to make wonderful things happen for downtown Winnipeg. I'd also like to thank our programming partners and sponsors, the Exchange District BIZ, CentreVenture Development Corporation, City of Winnipeg, Storefront Manitoba, PSAV, and the Winnipeg Free Press. Some general housekeeping just before we begin. You've probably walked by the washrooms on your way in, and of course, there's cookies, coffee, tea, water at the back, so please feel free to get up and nibble as you listen on tonight. The Downtown Winnipeg BIZ is your friendly and hardworking host that works thoroughly to improve the perception of downtown by providing a welcoming environment, keeping things clean and safe, and advocating for continuous and positive downtown revitalization. Our mandate is focused on undertaking and stimulating economic development and to improve and enhance our downtown. Through collaboration with our partners, stakeholders, and all levels of government, we continue to advocate for a better downtown in the best interests of our members and the general public who live, work, and play in the downtown. We'd also like to acknowledge the many visionary leaders in our community who have played significant roles in Portage and Main's history. Starting with Henry McKenney, who in 1862 purchased the land which Portage and Main sits on today. He chose this site where the north-south and east-west ox cart paths crossed in order to build a general store with his half-brother John Christian Schultz. Our current mayor, His Worship Brian Bowman, who is committed to advancing the reopening of Portage and Main as downtown continues to renew and to evolve. Over the last several decades, the desire to create a more livable and celebratory place at this iconic street corner has been discussed at length. With a new council and mayor, it's apropos that this conversation has elevated once more. We're excited by their tenacity and their forward thinking. Also, people like the late Val Werrier, also known as the Prince of Print Journalism, who worked at the Winnipeg Tribune and for the Winnipeg Free Press, and was a longtime advocate for the opening of Portage and Main. People like Glenn Murray, our former mayor, as well as Harry Finnegan, our former director of planning, who, together with Wins Bridgman, held an international design competition called City Crossing 12 years ago in an attempt to reopen Portage and Main. And they were so close. Councillors, too, like Jenny Gerbasi, who have never swayed from their understanding of the significance of tearing down the barricades. And all for good reason. Portage and Main is an intersection that is well known across Canada and famous in our own province. First occupied in the 1800s by a general store, it eventually became the center of the banking industry in Western Canada and is now a hub for office towers and professional offices, as well as some of our city's main transportation hubs. In its earlier days, this bustling intersection also served as an impromptu meeting place, as well as a venue for various parades and events. This ended in the late 1970s when construction of the Portage and Main Circus began, which permanently closed Portage and Main to pedestrians, as we know. In recent years, many Winnipeg residents have begun to discuss the reopening of Portage and Main to pedestrians, not only to repopulate the intersection at ground level, but to help revitalize our downtown, making it a more livable place for people that live and work here, and as a whole, to encourage greater economic investment and small business development. Today, We have had robust discussions with our keynote speaker, Tim Tompkins, and city directors, managers, planners, and city councilors, in addition to property owners at Portage Main. Tonight's forum is a chance for you, the public, to weigh in and to imagine what's possible for this iconic corner. In particular, we believe Winnipeggers will be interested in learning more about the engagement process that Tim Tompkins undertook with New York's business community, the public city departments, and more. By listening, mobilizing, and empowering these stakeholders through the collaborative planning process, he helped to forge a solution for what was deemed initially as their local challenge. Our local panelists will help guide us in our thinking on how we might get it done in Winnipeg. Can Portage Main reclaim its roots as a bustling place for people? John Kiernan, City of Winnipeg's Director of Planning, Property and Development, Angela Mathieson, President and CEO of CentreVenture Development Corporation, and Tim Tompkins, President and CEO of Times Square Alliance, will share their thoughts with us shortly tonight. But before we hear from our panelists, I'd like to welcome Councillor Jenny Gerbasi for the Fort Rouge East Fort Garry ward to give greetings on behalf of the city.
Well, thanks very much. It was kind of a last-minute thing that I'm speaking as the other person was not able to make it, but I don't think I'm at loss for words on this topic, as many of you probably know who know me and have lived in Winnipeg for any period of time. What an incredible turnout tonight. It's great to see so many people at standing room only to talk about planning. Once again, we are a city of geeks. No, just kidding. No, but it's something that's something people care about so much is this corner. This is an iconic intersection in our city. And I find anywhere else you go in Canada or you talk to people, they think of Portage Main as Winnipeg. It's part of Winnipeg. And to have it closed off to people has always struck me as very odd. But this conversation tonight and many others that will follow and have happened, but it's great that this conversation is really going, is to start having that conversation and imagining, as the title of this event is, Imagine Portage Main, and imagining our downtown the way we would love it to be, bustling and full of people and vibrant. And I really want to thank the Downtown BIZ for their leadership. I want to thank our downtown agency and our wonderful guests to share those experiences from New York. And you know, Times Square is not Portage Main, but it is iconic in New York. And when you think of New York, you think of Times Square. And when you think of Winnipeg, you think of Portage Main. So there are similarities, and there are similarities in the process of working together on that. And of course, I would be remiss in not mentioning, of course, I'm bringing greetings from our mayor, Brian Bowman, who has shown great courage and leadership and vision in having the courage to have this conversation, because we all know it's not easy to have these kind of conversations in our city. There's always going to be resistance to change, which is part of the process. It's part of the conversation. But it takes leadership and it takes political will to bring that change. And I really think we're coming to a place in this city where we have that political will to make the kind of changes we want to make our city better for people, for all our people, and to make our city proud. So with that, enjoy the evening, and thanks very much for coming out tonight.
Thank you, Jenny. As Director of Planning, Property and Development for the City of Winnipeg, John Kiernan has a passion for the design and use of public spaces. He leads a team of professionals in the Planning, Property and Development Department who provide a wide range of services related to city building, specifically planning, civic buildings, and facilitating private development. Prior to becoming director, John led a group of urban designers and planners whose work ranged from small pocket parks to large urban spaces, as well as community facilities and neighborhoods. In John's current role as the Director of Planning, Property and Development, he is responsible for city planning and urban design, building permits and inspections, 475 city-owned buildings, including buildings, pools, arenas, and libraries, the development of parks, plazas, and streetscapes, and 3 municipal cemeteries. John provides advice to the City of Winnipeg's Chief Administrative Officer, Mayor, and City Council on a wide variety of issues, including urban planning and design, project and facility implementation, and community building. He has 20 years experience in focusing on how people act, react, and enjoy those spaces. This expertise is built on his background in project management, landscape architecture, and history.
I'm very worried right now. I sound better on paper than I do in real life, but I'll let you guys, I'll let you be the judge of that. And cemeteries we just view as another form of subdivision. Really, it's interesting that we're having this conversation 40 years after an intersection has been closed. And we've had some, I've had an opportunity to sit in with Tim during the day. So for those of you, in respect for you standing at the back, we'll move through this quite quickly. We have some images just to promote thoughts for those of you in the audience, and to remind you of what the intersection was and might become. So when we talk about it, I'd like to frame the discussion. I think both the councillor and Stephanie did a great job of it. If it's about movement of people and traffic, it's an intersection that connects our city, and it's a sense of place that's created. And it's, yes, it's about pedestrians perhaps moving through the space, but it's that sense of place that still lives with us. Because apparently we're having trouble letting go, or we would have 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So the fact that you're in this room tonight shows you care. When we talk about it as it stands, and the examples we spoke about during the day with Tim, is Times Square is a place where people are that traffic moves through. And tonight's discussion is about a place traffic moves through that we want to introduce people into. And how do we do that, and how do we reconnect with our city? All right, that's always that moment of truth as you push the first slide. It's a key intersection because it's the focal point of Winnipeg. I think we've touched on that already. And I would suggest it's the intersection of 2 of the longest roads in Canada. I mean, you can get on Portage Avenue and travel to Calgary with a couple of bends around Portage and Regina and a few other things. But you can be on the road for the next 13 hours. You can also drive south to Minneapolis on the same road. And it's where the two, like our rivers, connect and collide at a point in Winnipeg. When we talk about it as Turtle Island, the heart of the continent. We talk about it being the heart of our province, and I would suggest that 700,000 people probably live within a 20-minute drive of Portage Main. So it becomes that heart of our province, and it's also the heart of our city. And this is why we're having these discussions tonight. We talk about time, place, connection, and celebration. And as we do it, we come together in all sorts of climates. I believe this one's the shot of the Santa Claus parade. We come in frequently to celebrate great sporting events and championships every quarter century or so. We also, it's a place where we come to demonstrate so that citizens can have their voices heard. And as part of that, it's also where there's a choreography of movement through this corner. It's traffic, it's people, it's time, and it's light and how we experience the very core of our city. I got overly ambitious there. So as we talked about the rivers and the connection, part of this is just how did Main Street and Portage come to be in place? And I was really disappointed they said I was doing the history because I did not take that as a compliment. I took that as ageism, to be honest with you. But I am one of, around my generation, you start and you have to really kind of think about remembering the corner when it was open. So it's living in our hearts a little differently than it's living in our reality, but let's try to link those two as we go through it. Main Street had a number of original names. It was originally called King's Highway and linked Upper Fort Garry with Lower Fort Garry. It was called Garry Road for a while, Garry Street, and then eventually Main Street. Portage Avenue was Portage Trail, and as it got to the University of Winnipeg, split into 3 different branches that ran to Upper Fort Garry, the second one, and which became Broadway in time, a second that connected down to the river, That in turn became St. Mary, and the third that became Portage Avenue as we know it today. In about 1870, there was discussion about renaming it Queen Street because speculators were selling pieces of Portage to new arrivals in Winnipeg, and they found they had title to new pieces of property in Portage La Prairie. This fine print said on Portage Avenue, not Portage Avenue itself. The history of the site and the evolution is Main Street was the first to expand, became basically Bankers Row. And as the price of land increased on Main Street, Portage Avenue then became more developed. Expansion occurred along Portage Avenue until probably around 1926 when the Hudson's Bay store was built. And for the next 75 years, the Hudson's Bay store on Memorial really marked our downtown. And that lasted for about the next 75 years. There's been civic demonstrations, and as we talk about 2019 coming, yes, it's a historic date for Portage and Main and a 40-year anniversary. It's also a 100-year anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike. And so there's those elements that occurred on Main Street. The intersection was a focal point, and some of those things I think can be tied together because they're part of our history, our culture, and what makes our location in which we live special. It's been a place historically for gathering, as well as currently. And yes, automobiles have been a problem for a number of years. When we talk about agreements and what can happen at Portage and Main and kind of how it looks today, this is a shot from around about 1960. I'd like to talk about the legal agreements, the agreements City and Council put in place. So it was closed in '79. The legal agreement is in place to 2019. There's an option for those property owners to renew it, and that was a right given to them by council in 1988, and that was that they can extend it for another 40 years unilaterally, should they wish. And so that's part of the information that we need to do this collaboratively. It needs to make sense for all of the partners and stakeholders as we move forward in these conversations. Stephanie mentioned, and the boards are at the back, from City Crossing, an event that took place in 2004, about 12 years ago. And so I'm just going to take you through a couple of the images of that. And you've got the demonstrations at the back, but it was trying to reimagine the corner differently. There are ideas of, instead of pedestrians going under, cars going over. There's some very ambitious schemes, and a couple of us were looking at them earlier, that look sort of like spaghetti strands of both lanes of traffic and pedestrian and bike lanes weaving their way through the intersection. But it was the idea of starting to think about the space below ground, at grade, and above in a different concept, and starting to link the above and below grade components. The options associated with some of the designs were to look at those connections above and below from street level down, and to look at an opportunity if it was fully open, partially open but being closed from 3 to 6 p.m., some crossings, and an opportunity to do it evenings, weekends, or for the entire summer. And so it was kind of like, what are those possibilities? What is the range that makes sense, that can work? The successful submission at that time was Janet Rosenberg from Toronto with Corbett Sidnall Architects. They included a light forest, building lighting strategies, planting islands, video screens, furnishings, improved street level and below level intersections. And at that time, a $10 million budget was requested to be able to move that forward. I know you'll be surprised when I tell you that didn't happen. So what is it about making a sense of place? Public space as a whole, it's unique. It's a place through which people move, experience, and it becomes a destination. The examples we use for placemaking can be heroic. I mean, I would also say Arc de Triomphe, you actually go down underground and come back up to it at the end of the Champs-Élysées. But it's that sense of space and monumental. It can be delightful, it can be ethereal. And so as you look at some of these ideas, this is not about this is a solution for Winnipeg, but it's starting to think about the space at Portage and Main, the 10 lanes that you have to cross of traffic. Think about it differently as a three-dimensional object and really being the heart of our city. We have our own sort of iconic elements. Like it or not, Many do. Some have other opinions. I like it. But it's that sense of place that's created where you say, meet you at the Cube. It anchored Old Market Square that was kind of being lost. It's an interesting counterpoint to the Exchange District, but it's a way of thinking of this, your space, our city, in a different manner, different materials, different uses. Chicago, it was, I always go the bean, but it's the cloud, I believe, was it the title by the artist that became the bean, reflecting the city skyline, the image, the clouds, the movement, the changing light. And the one that kind of has always like seduced me from an architectural perspective is a very simple box. This is on the southeast corner of Central Park. It's the Apple Store. So when you talk about transparency, it's also across the street, but it's also above and below grade. So yes, a very, not simple, it is a glass box, and it has that, but it's that connectivity down to the subterranean. When you say going down underground, going into the circus, it can be a much more elegant statement of space than the escalators, the stairs that are currently in place. So under fast facts, and I'm rounding figures off so they stuck both in my brain and hopefully yours. Over 70,000 vehicles go through Portage and Main in a day. And we'll stay with the 70,000 plus. 70,000 plus people work in the downtown. Nearly 17,000 people live in the downtown. And when on February 29th in 1979 when it closed, people felt some sense of loss. And so how do we make those connections in a way that makes sense for property owners, tenants, the public, people who move around, and people who move through the space, even in their vehicles? I always go back to, when I think about opening the intersection, I think about my mom, who's an aggressive walker. And the fact that if the light changed, she always feels she can make it no matter what. Highly ambitious, 89 years old, but those are the people that we also need to accommodate. And so when we're talking about movement and the choreography of the corner, it's also about that safety component and how we handle that and how we link for all ages to be able to make use of this space. Yeah, what's the slogan? We want everyone's mom to be safe. When we talk about movement, it's the study of movement. It's that choreography, as I mentioned. It's about moving through and under. And for those of you that pay attention to certain things like this, the City of Winnipeg initiated a request for a planning study to be undertaken. It went on our website for those of you that are interested last week. It's a request to retain consultants, to buy independent expertise, to look at this corner and do some analysis so that we can move forward with facts and information. When we talk about people moving, instead of moving away from Portage Main, we like to bring them down. It's about connectivity of the East and West Exchange, connectivity to the museum, to the MTS Center, and to, in time, the rest of the downtown. And that's why Tim's here. We're going to look at Times Square. And so part of that challenge is, yes, there's people in Times Square, vehicles move through. How do we change that around for people being introduced into Winnipeg and in our iconic corner? If we're opening the corner to citizens, we have to give them a destination that's worthy of their attention and a reason to go there. So just opening the corner is a good visit once. To come back, what should be there? And that's where it's really important to partner with the property owners, look at the opportunities they have. When we're talking about restaurants and animation and patios spilling out on the plaza spaces in and around Portage and Main, you know, yes, we can design things that are buffered from wind. Yes, we can design them to take advantage of 3 seasons. I'm not pushing on the 4th unless you're more adventurous than I. But it's how we handle those components, how we look at the space, how you safely cross an intersection that's sort of a airplane shape to it. Can we look at partial closings? And what my takeaway from Tim today was, let's test things. Let's look at things. Let's see what works. Let's build on what works and adjust on it as we go along. And it will be a process. And that's why we said this is the start of conversations. This is the start of engaging property owners, stakeholders, the community like yourselves that come out that care. When we look forward, this is a light sculpture, light optics. We don't have to be heavy-handed. We don't need to have a firm hand on the land. One of our fellows in our office had pulled out the sculptures by Janet Eckelman, and talked about the idea of, could we do Northern Lights at Portage and Main? Could we have sort of a ethereal, hanging, ghostly shape fluctuating and moving over it as an iconic beacon? I'm not saying that's an answer. It's about thinking about the corner a little differently. And that was an accountant who brought that to me. So I kind of went, okay, well, there is interest then. And so as we talk about it, tonight is about having those conversations, those opportunities, how we work with partners, and to remember we're looking at three things: the movement of people and traffic, how the intersection connects with our city, and a sense of place created by Portage and Main. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and I'm just a speed bump on the way to your keynote, so thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I'd now like to introduce Angela. Angela Mathieson is the president and CEO of CentreVenture, the city's downtown development corporation, whose mandate is to provide leadership in the planning, development, and implementation of projects and activities in the downtown. Prior to joining CentreVenture, Angela was an urban planning consultant and served as Manitoba's Assistant Deputy Minister of Urban Affairs and Secretary to Cabinet for Community and Economic Development. She is a city planner, a passionate Winnipegger, and devoted advocate for revitalization of our downtown. I'll hand over things to Angela.
So I don't know if I should tell John that I remember the day that Portage Main closed. I was 7.
I was born.
Anyways, thanks, Stephanie. And it's a pleasure to be here today on the panel. And I guess I should put it on record that I do believe that we should find a way to open Portage and Main to pedestrian through traffic. I'm not going to pretend to know how to do this, and I'll leave that to the engineers and the planners and the designers, to John and his team to figure that out. And I know that Tim's going to tell us a little bit about how they did tackle sort of a similar challenge in Times Square in Manhattan. But what I do know is that if we can open this intersection, I think we can also open a whole range of possibilities to further develop and densify our downtown, to fill in some of the gaps that exist today. Some due in part to the lack of a strong pedestrian connection in parts of the downtown. In real estate development, there's the old adage, it's all about location, location, location. And it is true that economics and development tends to drive initially to be close to or to have an affinity with something that's valuable. It's a strategic and competitive advantage in real estate. I think the branding of Times Square is a perfect example of that. And in Winnipeg, we have some strong commercial districts in our downtown that are flourishing because of their strategic location or because of the assets that exist there and have become a strong draw for people. And we have some commercial areas in the downtown that don't have some of those immediate advantages, and I think of South Main Street, for example. With the Forks, we've seen tremendous assets develop there based on proximity to the river and obviously the parkway that's been built there, and the great work of the Forks Renewal Corporation as well as the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. In the case of the East Exchange, we have that kind of river thinking, if you like, expanding into that area with the development of Waterfront Drive in the early 2000s. And that's really opened a brand new neighborhood where people and businesses are being drawn to be part of the waterfront and the turn of the century warehouses that are a good part of that neighborhood. And in the case of the West Exchange, that's really developed based on Manitoba's strong arts community as its anchor, and more recently with Red River College. And people are really flocking to that district to be part of that creative culture and the wonderful heritage buildings in really our most walkable downtown neighborhood. And in the last decade, we have something called the Sports, Hospitality, and Entertainment District, the SHAD, and that's really, people are being drawn to that because of the expanded convention center and the MTS Center and obviously the Winnipeg Jets. And in our work, we're meeting more and more with businesses who are interested in being a part of that activity in that area and all of what's going on there. But you know, really all of these advantages are advantages for the entire downtown. And although we say we have a large downtown, and when compared to our population, we certainly do, but in fact our downtown is only about 3 square kilometers. And for Tim's benefit, that's roughly the size of Central Park. It's only a 9-minute walk from Old Market Square to the MTS Center. It's an 8-minute walk from Red River College to the Muir Hotel. And it's a 10-minute walk from the Millennium Library to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. So I do think that no matter where you are in the downtown, there's a location advantage. But the key challenge is the state of the pedestrian connections between all of those great assets in our downtown. How strong, how easy, how intuitive are those connections? And it's clear to me that we need some work to be done in this particular area. You know, I think of if I was, working at CDI College, say on South Main Street, I'm only an 8-minute walk from Parlor Coffee, but do I even really know that? And I know if you've had Parlor Coffee, you'd probably walk a lot further to get that. And really, that's the same with so many of the great assets that we have in our downtown. How pleasant, how easy, how clear is that walk to those assets? You know, so at CentreVenture, we're looking at building, all of our downtown districts and filling in some of the gaps. And we know as we're doing that, there's a tremendous amount of value in strengthening and improving the connections between those districts so that our downtown really operates in a collaborative way. So that the Forks can benefit from the West Exchange and the Shed can benefit from the Forks and vice versa. And to do this, we really do need strong quality street-level pedestrian connections. Pedestrians really do drive commerce in the downtown, and we do need more of that. So right now, we are limited in some ways by the fact that when we're looking at making those connections, we're sort of limited by almost this sort of ring road effect that's happening as a result of Portage Main not being easily accessible to pedestrians. And in particular, we're looking very closely at South Main Street in the area east of Portage Main. And I think we are limited in what we can achieve there in the shorter term, so long as Portage Main is closed. There we go. So what, from our perspective as the Cities Development Corporation, we'd like to see more opportunities to have better and more direct connections between all of our districts in the downtown. Really connections so that if I open a restaurant on Lombard, I can benefit from the Jets being in the playoffs. And if I open a brew pub on Gary Street, I can benefit from all the events at the Concert Hall or the Fringe Fest. Or if I locate my office on South Main Street, my employees can get to Parlor Coffee without going overtime on their break. So we see, sorry, this thing's not working super well. Yeah, I gotta go like that, I guess. Eh? John, do you know how to do this? I think this was actually in here. Oh, there we go. It's upside down. How did that happen? That is not actually how I do imagine Portage and Main. Sorry. Sorry about that. No, not normally. We see tremendous infill opportunities on South Main, but as long as that main artery really continues to be mainly an automobile thoroughfare, isolated from some of the great assets in the downtown, it's going to be really, truly difficult to achieve that potential. It will be hard to achieve that sort of location advantage that drives so much of real estate development. So as we move forward to encourage development on South Main, we will be doing so by trying to strengthen those connections, into the Forks and out of the Forks, back down into the Shed District. But I do really believe, and I think it will be more effective if we had easier and direct pedestrian connections through Portage and Main to the Exchange District, and I think could open up even further development opportunities for this district. That really is upside down. Don't know how that happened. So when I Manage and Portage Main opened up, I guess that's sort of what we're asked to do today. I do see South Main Street as really going to be one of the main beneficiaries of that action. And I do think that that and East Portage will have a fighting opportunity to develop into quality pedestrian streets that we really need to foster commerce and development in that area. I think that we really want people to leave their car in their parkade and walk to Earl's instead of drive there. I think that would be a huge improvement. And we'd like to see places like Times Change integrated with a great cluster of renewed heritage buildings. And we really want to see Upper Fort Garry. When you enter and you see Upper Fort Garry, you know that you've arrived in the downtown and not something just to pass by to get through downtown. So I think it's important that we thoughtfully have this dialogue and that we do it now so that we can plan more effectively for the future. And I'm pleased that CentreVenture is part of this dialogue today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. I'd now like to invite Tim, our keynote speaker, up to the podium in a second. Tim Tompkins has been the president of the Times Square Alliance in 2002 and the incoming president of the International Downtown Association. Prior to coming to the Alliance, he was the founder and director of Partnerships for Parks, which works to support New York City's neighborhood parks. He has worked at New York City's Economic Development Corporation, the New York City Charter Revision Commission, and many other things in his career. He has an undergraduate degree from Yale and an MBA from Wharton, and currently teaches a class on urban economic development at the NYU Wagner School. We'll hand it over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Yes, the man with the cemetery, as I said, I've never actually been on a panel with someone who really knows where the bodies are buried. So first of all, I just want to say, wow, look at this room full of people. I mean, this level of participation about something in New York City would, fill Yankee Stadium. It's amazing. I mean, in terms of if you adjust it proportionally, but the thing that also says to me, the thing that says to me is that this really is a place that is central to the imagination and the identity of Winnipeg, if I didn't think it already. Because, and I heard some talk show radio stuff where people are like, this is the stupidest idea I've ever heard, just riding around today with Stefano. And again, people are passionate about it, which is what happened when people started talking about making changes in Times Square. And it's good because it means that this place matters, that it's central to the psyche. I also just want to say it's great to be here in this city. And I also want to give a shout out and a thank you to Stefano Grande. When he saw me give a presentation about Times Square a few years ago, he said, there's really some similarities about the things that you guys have been looking at and struggling with and the things that we are here. And so the second I got up here and looked on a map and then looked in person at Portage and Main, I really understood what he was talking about in terms of the centrality of the space. So I want to start off also just by acknowledging that I totally get that Winnipeg is not New York City, that they're very different places. So I'm not coming here with some answers or some set of opinions about what ought to happen or what ought to be translated. I recognize as well that Canada and the US are very different places in terms of in many ways. And one of the reasons I know that is because for about 25 years, my sister, who was a great poet and wrote a book that was listed as number 25 on National Post's best poetry books of last year. So if you're not a planner and you're also a poet, I encourage you to read her work. But she lived in Vancouver, and she would talk about how embarrassed she would be sometimes to be an American because these Americans would come and like honk their horns and be noisy and be pushy. And so I wanted to start off by saying to you that even though I arrived here by jet, it was not my own jet, and I am not the Donald, okay? I'm not coming here to insult Winnipeg. So shifting to other topics. So it's important to quote from Jean Jacobs, who I may note, this will also help me from getting too cocky. She moved from a certain city in the U.S. To a certain city in Canada. So maybe she knew like who had it right. But I think the important thing about Jane Jacobs, and I really got to know her work better when I was working in the parks world, was this idea that a public space, the space in between buildings, a park, is not good in and of itself, but it's a reflection of whatever the assets and the life of the community around it is, and the way in which it connects that community. And I think that was a real lesson for us in Times Square, and I think it may be relevant in other ways. So as I said, I started off my work in dealing with parks and making these connections and learning about processes for engaging with communities. One of the places we focused on was the Bronx River that got some attention. There was a case study done about it. It was a place, this amazing but narrow public space, this river running through the Bronx, that people literally lived a few blocks from and didn't know it existed. It wasn't a community asset, even though it was a public space. And so areas that were formerly, but after years of working on making connections and connecting it to the neighborhood, it went from looking like this along its riverbanks to it becoming a great park and a great public space, from being a place where literally stolen cars were dumped after they were stolen in the Bronx, to a place that people would come down and come to life and be a real asset for a neighborhood. So it's the exact same space, but through connection and connectivity and community involvement, it really turned into an asset. Turning to Times Square. It's named after the New York Times. That's their original headquarters. That's the building the ball drops from today, which is unrecognizable, covered with ads. But named after the New York Times. It was always an intersection, and an intersection mostly for cars. There wasn't a lot of there in terms of public space, but it still was central because it was a crossroads and because it was linked to the core identity, also spoken of as the heart of the city, the core of the identity of the city. And frankly, things that people like and don't like about cities, about America, about capitalism, all have been embodied in Times Square. It went through very rough times where there was a great deal of crime. 42nd Street, which is photographed here, was the most dangerous block in America. And there were a lot of big picture efforts to try and change it. And in some ways, people focused not on the small spaces, but on the big things. And they almost destroyed Times Square. There was a point at which this proposal was fully approved and ready to go. The real estate market crashed in the late 80s, so it didn't happen. But you'll notice that center building is actually twice the height of that New York Times building. And the New York Times building, after which Times Square is named, from which the New Year's Eve ball is dropped, was going to be knocked down. Because they're like, just get rid of it. It's in the way. It's old. It's useless. And there were also no signs on those buildings. So again, to its credit, the civic community rose up and said, oh my God, in trying to change this place, you've almost destroyed it. They passed a law saying that if you have a building in Times Square, you literally have to have an advertisement on it to preserve its character. They did a competition to imagine what that Times Square building how it could be transformed, which was really a stall tactic to get people to think about its value and to leave it alone. And then, and they also passed a law to preserve the historic theaters, which were being torn down right, left, and center in the name of development. So when we came in 1992, those big plans were still stalled, but the New York Times and the theater owners said, we just need to focus on the smaller things that are happening in the public spaces. They didn't name it that way because that language wasn't really being used, but it was to make Times Square clean, safe, and fun, as opposed to dirty, dangerous, and terrifying, which is what it was. By the time I came in and got the job in 2002, we were doing well on that front, and we had the luxury to think about not just making it functional as opposed to dysfunctional, but making this public space aspirational. And so we focused on what are the core characteristics of Times Square we wanted to nurture: its creativity, its energy, and its edge. The baseline was making it a positive public space, but then how is it aspirational? Just a little bit about us. The gray area is what our district is. It's really the theater district. That covers essentially all the Broadway theaters. What most people think of Times Square is that narrow X of an intersection in yellow in the middle, which is what people call the bow tie or the center of Times Square. We're a business improvement district, like the business improvement zones, like parks organizations that took care of parks that I worked with. A lot of our job is about connecting and interacting with government and the community. And part of the problem is, especially 20 or 25 years ago, before these partnerships existed, this was the way that government dealt with the public. It was sort of one way, and you barely acknowledged that they were on their side. Over time, and you know, different administrations go through different cycles of this. Over time, sometimes they acknowledge that there's someone on the other side. Then they start interacting with them, but it's in a very rigid way. Then it becomes a little bit more lively, and again, this can vary with the department and the agency and the people. And then, you know, then you have different agencies, because sometimes the agencies don't talk to each other, sometimes the people in the community don't talk to each other, but it gets a little more complicated. And then if you're really doing everything right, this is from an art exhibit in Singapore, which I saw, and I said, this is a metaphor. And I went back and found the other pictures. Then it's like this. And guess what? It's what we're doing here. It's messy, right? You've got all these different points of view. There's no completely clear set of rules, but you're interacting and something better comes out of it. And I think that that's part of what's happening here with this whole process of imagining. But it ain't easy. Really quickly, in terms of the things we did in our first 10 years, we took events like New Year's Eve, tried to make them a little bit more photogenic to shape perceptions about Times Square. We paid a lot of attention to the just clean and safe, clean streets, working on social problems in the streets, partnering with homeless service organizations for emotionally disturbed or challenged people out in the streets. We worked on taking the assets inside the buildings like Broadway and taking them out into the public spaces to show people that the public spaces could be alive. And that the assets around us could come to life. Always working with the police on public safety issues. And then again, as I said, by the time I came in, we were able to have the luxury of saying not just how do we make this space functional, but how do we make it aspirational? And how do we tap into all of the assets, not just around Times Square, but of the entire city? And I think that's very analogous for Portage and Main. It was incredible just to see those districts that were just spoken about, the Forks, the Shed, the Exchange, and the Waterfront, which I got a quick tour of today, and just see how close they are, and literally that this is sort of the hub from which those things come and that they feed into. So a first thing we did, I'll talk a little bit more about that, was taking we had a huge design competition before I was there, approaching the millennium that wasn't realized, and we changed that space by building this, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it was also about, again, tapping into the assets around, the artistic assets, bringing events and bringing New Yorkers back to this space that they were kind of cynical about through events like this, yoga in Times Square, reminding people of our history. We had a little historical exhibition for quite a while. And the net result of all this over time, not just our efforts, but everyone's, is that an asset, from an economic point of view, an asset that was severely underperforming became something that was a major driver of the economy and jobs. And that, you know, long-term is very important as well. And I want to note that I think, you know, when we think about cities, we have to compete with the other parts of the cities, but we have to compete with the suburbs as well. And things cost more in cities. It's complicated to get around. If you just plunk a suburban shopping mall down into the middle of the city, it doesn't do so well. And so the only way you can compete is by creating a positive public space experience and pedestrian experience. And so it's fundamental to competitiveness to pay attention to that. So when I came in, I say that the problem before I came around was that you couldn't get through Times Square without getting killed or mugged. The problem by the time I came into the job was that you couldn't get through Times Square. It was just incredibly crowded and there was not enough space. We had these narrow sidewalks and a lot going on. But we didn't really, there wasn't a clear and easy answer because, of course, there's cars that needed to get through. We had to do a lot of studies. And some of this was to justify potential changes to the administration, the traffic engineers. But some of it was really to understand the problem because you can't just go and say, we're going to change it overnight. So we did studies about where the cars were coming from, where they were going to, what the traffic patterns, because just for example, normally in a central business district, a Saturday is a slow day. Well, we have Broadway theaters, we've got 2 sets of shows, and we have 20% of the city's hotel rooms. So on a Saturday, we're super busy. Monday evening is actually relatively quiet. So the facts in every place and every situation, hour by hour, day by day, are different, and that was a really important thing. And we also had to find out what really bothered people, because for our property owners that have these big office towers, you know, the people that worked in those towers, how did they feel? That's how we found out, started to zoom in on pedestrian congestion being the big problem. 96% of them said that they, you know, and this is different from what you have here. So again, it's another reason our solutions aren't your solutions necessarily. 96% of the people were walking in the street because there wasn't enough room on the sidewalks, which, by the way, wasn't good for keeping the traffic flowing either, because all the numbers were going up, tourism and ridership. But I also understand that tourism is becoming a more important part of this economy. I see the development. It's astonishing what I've seen and heard today about the renaissance of Winnipeg over the last 10 or 15 years. And so you can only assume is that those pressures, pedestrian and pressures, are also going to increase. Sorry, let me. I think I hit it backwards and then I got stuck. So is there another? Yes? Do we know, is there another? Oh, there we are. Okay. So pedestrian growth. Pedestrians increased. Which way do I point this? So we started talking about our problems. The gridlock, you know, you've heard of pedlock. Gridlock with cars. We talked about pedlock. Okay, do we know? Okay, it's just going slowly. We talked about how ugly the pedestrian spaces were. But most importantly, we also began to say, what are the core characteristics of this place? We went to an advertising agency in our district and said, do a kind of brand analysis. And they said that Times Square is about the experience of being in a city, that it's synonymous with the experience of New York City. And I think that also, you know, part of what you're getting at major intersections or when you walk around Winnipeg is that experience, the urban experience and the experience of what Winnipeg is about. We went to people who had written histories about Times Square and books about Times Square. And it's interesting, I see on the sheet here, on the Imagine sheet, it encourages you to record your memories. And I think it's very important when you're dealing with an iconic place to recall what the place has been about, what are its core characteristics as you're shaping a vision for it. We decided that we wanted to emphasize the design assets that we had. And we brought together planners and architects and said, how do we get this right? And they said, you know, don't overdo it. Remember, Times Square should be a little bit chaotic. Choreograph it, but it should be chaotic. It's a city. They said, don't just think about the big signs, the 200 feet high signs. Think about what's happening down on the ground on the human level. And they said, remember that not just for tourists, but also for New Yorkers, people like to watch the life of the city. Some people just like, part of what being out in a public space is about observing what's going on. So we talked about problems and possibilities. We talked about, do we know why it's taking so much longer? No, we don't. Oh, you're just doing it. Okay, so next. So we talked about, so I'll just put this down now. Like, how were you going to tell me? So anyway, we started talking about important pedestrians are next. And we talked about a set of principles. We said, make it a place that New Yorkers want to come to. And how do you do that? You do that by nurturing what's authentic and what's historic. We talked about think about things on the human scale. We used the metaphor of a theater set to say, don't overbuild it. Keep it simple. Create a space where things can happen, where things change there, as opposed to just making a big, grand architectural statement. Next. So what does that mean going forward? So the first thing we did is we talked about this stuff because initially we were talking about creating a little bit more public space, and we started off by just trying to take the space where you get discount tickets in Times Square and trying to make it larger. So right now, this is after Broadway has been closed, but we took up a lane, next slide please. We took up, essentially, this was the narrow sliver of space. The only public space was that space over on the right, this little fenced-in area that nobody ever sat in. So we started off by just arguing that we could get a lane of Broadway and a lane of 7th Avenue, which is on either side of that, and the world would not end. And we made a lot of arguments for that, and we did eventually get that space enlarged. Next. And we also, in this case, we went ahead with this thing that had been an idea that had been stuck for 8 or 9 years. This was built, and part of the reason it worked is because it tapped into the authentic characteristics of Times Square. The steps mimicked a Greek amphitheater, referencing theater, and they also glowed in the dark, which were reflective of the lights of Times Square. So we tapped into the theater and the signage, which are characteristics of Times Square. This was also important because Times Square is synonymous with New York's brand. And so similarly, I think that in many ways what I've heard is that Portage Main is synonymous with at least some parts of the identity of Winnipeg. And so doing something right here, it doesn't have to be an architectural statement, but getting it right is important for the identity of Winnipeg. Next. We brought in people like Jan Gell, who was from Copenhagen, and this is very important. He said, be willing to experiment. Do small things incrementally. You don't have to do these big, heavy interventions, but play around a little bit. And over the time, because he showed us these charts in Copenhagen, how over 20 or 30 years it became a biking city, it became a pedestrian city, whereas it was very much a car city before. But by doing it incrementally, they learned as they went, and they didn't just make assumptions or approach it from an ideological point of view. Next. And we brought in someone from London where they had also done just wayfinding. They had closed parts of Trafalgar Square. They had tried to improve the pedestrian environment. That was important. And we did things kind of like this where we had architects come in. And the point is, and these are like the less radical things. We had things where people were planting these giant trees, these incredible, frankly, in my mind, very strong ego statements by architects that weren't really about what Times Square was. It was about what the architect was. And there were some very thoughtful ones as well. But I think that sometimes there's a temptation to say like this big dramatic thing. The most important thing about this, as with this kind of exercise, is it just helped people imagine something different. And particularly on the left, because Times Square was so partitioned, the public spaces and the sidewalks, it was hard to imagine it even as a coherent square, and which I think is a little bit of what happens sometimes out here with Portage Main. Next. So we started off with very little space for pedestrians. Next. And then, again, with a previous transportation commissioner, we got an incremental change in the traffic patterns after a lot of studies, which was going to be about getting a little more space on the sidewalks and creating a kind of central promenade that you could go on. And again, that made sense as a way of testing some ideas. Next. But then there was a new transportation commissioner appointed. Mayor Bloomberg went from being not so green to being very green. And she said, you've been talking about pedestrian space. Why don't we just close Broadway, which is one of those two streets in Times Square. So we took a deep breath and we thought, you know what? We've been talking about improving the pedestrian environment, and we should try it. Now, very importantly, the mayor said, I'm going to try this out. Now, I think Jeanette Sadek-Khan, who was a real visionary in the transportation world, she was sort of thinking, we're doing this, okay, we're doing this. But the mayor really said, and we believed him, I'm going to test this out, we're going to try it out, and I'm going to come back to you, the community, the Times Square Alliance, and find out how you guys feel about it after 6 months. And that was really important because there were things that needed to be learned, and people needed to know that it was that there was a real community engagement. Next. And so at the start, also, it was super cheap. And this picture shows you how it's super cheap. I mean, literally, it was like, this is the street, we're just closing it down, which is another core lesson. But it's funny. Before, all the taxi drivers were saying, it's going to destroy Times Square. There's all that. That's all the news stories were about, the taxi drivers being unhappy. And they'd say, what? But the man in the street says it's going to be really bad. I was like, and they just showed me a TV clip of like these interviews with taxi drivers. I was like, that's not the man in the street. That's a taxi driver in a car. But it was funny. Then we bought these cheapo lawn chairs. People sat down in them like they'd been hanging out lounging around in Times Square their entire lives. It was absolutely bizarre. And then people started debating whether they liked the lounge chairs, which in my mind was the paradigm shift had occurred. Instead of talking about 2 or 3 miles per hour of car speeds, they were talking about whether they liked the chairs, which was really a conversation about what kind of image they wanted to represent and what kind of public space they wanted it to be. Next. Some people hated it and hated the chairs. Next. Some people loved it. Some people made T-shirts about it, like I love Times Square, I lounge Times Square, okay, whatever. But the bottom line is we went back to people and we asked. These were the people who, sorry, Ford. These are the people who spent the most time in Times Square, the people who work in the office buildings, who had to sort of suffer with Times Square. Before, the majority of them were not satisfied with their experience in Times Square. Afterwards, after 6 months of this, 74% of them changed. Big, huge change. Next slide. And then we because it was very important economically, theater goers, there's a lot of people that arrived at the theater by car. We also did surveys of them, and 70% of them said we asked, should the plazas be made permanent? They said yes. Next. Residents, next. The people who worked in Times Square, next. The largest employers, our board of directors, which represents a cross-section of the neighborhood, next. So all those categories, including retailers, not by as big a margin, because there was a lot of anxiety on the part of retailers about what the closings would do, but they still, by 2/3 to 4/5 majority, said that the plaza should be made permanent. Again, the end result was that the retail actually got stronger because the pie got bigger, more people were coming to Times Square, especially this concept of kind of dwell time. Instead of people just sort of moving along quickly and sort of because they had to get through and get by on the sidewalks, they spent a little more time in the space. They would notice the stores around them. They would notice the signs. And so it ended up helping sort of the retail environment. Go ahead. Here's a little video about it. He likes the idea. So, you know, and isn't that what cities are about? It's about, you know, this we watch. I talk about how you sit on the red steps, you sit in the chair in Times Square, you're watching what we call the second best show on Broadway, which is the life of the city itself. And, you know, when I stepped out of got in last night, stepped out of the Fairmont, and I looked at these vantages of from Portage and Main of just looking down Portage and the different ways that it sort of shoots off the Central Star, and I thought, this is a place to watch and to be watched and to see the life of the city. So slowly, by the way, the rendition there is we are now building out that ugly pavement into a European-style piazza. They've decided now to put the real money in. They didn't do it, you know, at first because they wanted to test out the idea, and that's being built. And it's a mess because it's under construction. But already people are saying that, and we've got our challenges in Times Square. But New Yorkers love to be cynical about Times Square, and articles like this started to shift. Like, would this Times Square actually be a place where New Yorkers might want to hang out? Next. And so this is what it looked like, and we started bringing it to life. And again, now it's sort of under construction. Oh, another point was just that circumstances change. Like when we built those red steps, I would go to the head of the theater organization, one of the biggest Broadway organizations, who's no longer with us, but he was one of the founders of the BID. And every time he saw the renderings, he'd say, "What are you going to do about the bums and prostitutes that are going to sleep on those steps?" And, it was based on, 30 years of his experience of a public space in Times Square was a space where bad things were going to happen. And in fact, in 1977, around the time when you closed Portage Main, there was a New York Times editorial which was backed by, obviously, the Times, which helped found our organization, and also the theater owners, that said, don't close Broadway down. The exact same proposal to close a part of Broadway. And they said, don't close it down because it'll become a pimp and prostitute promenade, which I thought was pretty good alliteration, or poets themselves. But that's what the facts were at that point. The New York City couldn't control its public spaces. And so, that kind of aspiration wasn't possible. So the exact same space at different times has different possibilities. So this space got created, and then we had a new set of problems because there are a lot of hustlers and hawkers that popped out. The regulatory framework, go ahead, next slide. The regulatory framework, we had, Mickey Mouse is shaking people down, only in America. And then next slide, lots of articles about this kind of stuff happening. And, there were some regulations. It was kind of this regulatory loophole where you didn't have any ability to set regulations about commercial activity on plazas. But the next slide. But what happened is that the police commissioner said, my solution to this problem is to rip up the plazas. And Mayor de Blasio equivocated. And next slide. And so the commissioner said, dig the damn thing up. And I said, so we can't manage or control our public spaces? That's not a solution, that's a surrender. And the reaction was overwhelming as people said, wait a minute. As much as, and believe me, the people in Times Square are pretty annoyed about what's going on in the plazas now. They're under construction, you got Mickey Mouse shaking you down, it's not a good scene. But when pressed to this question of like, do we want to give up this pedestrian space we've created, not framed exactly that way, but do you want to dig up the damn plazas? People are like, no way. There was this overwhelming push in the other direction. And not just among civic groups, but among people. Next slide. And part of the good thing that came out of this whole conversation was this recognition, which I think is what's going on now, is that this place is central to the identity, the id of the city. And as it goes, and if it's failing, if it's a success, if it's aspirational, then that's a reflection one way or another of, are we in this mindset where we say we can't create a public space because it's going to be overrun by pimps and prostitutes? Are we going to rip up a public space because we can't quite figure out how to manage it? Or are our aspirations higher than that? Next. And so part of that is bringing things to life, reminding people of the history. We remind people of the famous sailor-nurse kiss with fun programming. Next. We try a bunch of experiments. And this is really the beta phase with these new plazas. Things to try and bring the New Yorkers there, make it feel like it's a New York town square rather than just for tourists. Public art projects. Next slide. Using public art and architects to help people see Times Square in a different way, and also to promote things like Valentine's Day celebrations. Having public art projects that reference the core of this. Part of the reason people love and hate Times Square is because it's about capitalism, it's about America, it's about big, loud brashness. So have fun with the identity, the things that people love about a place. And this was a great participatory art project that someone came up with. Go ahead. This is the idea of taking the assets of New York City and putting them on display. This is the Metropolitan Opera opening night. Now, there's still cars going by here, but it was bringing that to the square. Go ahead. Public art projects on the big screens in Times Square. Next. So fundamentally, next, what we've been doing is saying, all right, so we talked about things we don't want. What's our aspiration? And I think that's the exercise you're going through now. Next slide, please. Imagine. What is it? We know what your nightmare is, but what's your dream? What do you want to see here? What do you imagine? And this starts to shape the next slide. The beginnings, and this is still a work in progress, the beginnings of a vision of what we want Times Square to be. That's based on people's comments and dreams and aspirations. Next slide. And so, go ahead. Some of those things for us are to be changing, but don't forget about our past. Next. The balance, the commercial and the civic, which is the city, the agora, the marketplace. It's a mixture of civic and commercial activity. Next. For us to curate programming but allow for things to happen spontaneously and unexpectedly. Next. To be transparent, a democratic public space, but not be a free-for-all that's out of control. Next. To welcome both the tourists and the New Yorkers. Go ahead. And what's that look like? You know, everything from street furniture to the retail offerings to creative activity throughout the square. Next. And so that might be, you know, a great dance troupe practicing and rehearsing in the space. Next. It might be bringing a newsstand back for some art projects. Next. Also, before I move on, I just want to say there's a couple other really relevant examples that I just thought about today, so I added these slides in. You know, Piccadilly Circus, they had barriers. They didn't close down the street. Next slide. But they took down the barriers, and so there's probably some very relevant lessons there in terms, and it was all part of this trying to make the city more pedestrian friendly. Next. There's also a place, Oxford Circus in London, where it was at a very traditional crossing. Next slide. They both made it prettier, but also did this thing called the Barnes Dance, where they allowed people to cross from different directions. So two very, very relevant things for you all, I think, to look at, where again, you know, London is not Winnipeg, Winnipeg is not London, but there might be some interesting lessons there. Next. Overall, there's been a few set of core principles. Next. One is just with public spaces for us, it's got to be well designed, but it also has to be managed. You have to be able to manage it. You have to make it safe, but it's also got to be programmed. What happens in those public spaces has to be reflective of what is authentic of that place. Next. For us, these are, I think, some really relevant points, that the circumstances and the facts from 20 years ago may be different from now, but we have to know really what those facts are. It was very helpful when the mayor and others allowed us to take a chance and to try something, knowing that we could reverse it, knowing that we could adjust it, because there were some things that got wrong, and there were some things we really had to push back on when we started to do it. And recognizing that what's right for Times Square is not right for another neighborhood in New York, is not right for Winnipeg. Each place is different, partially because the facts are different, partially because the core DNA of a place is different. Next. For us, it's very important that there was a process of the community and government working together. It sounds like there's a real spirit of cooperation from this administration, from everything I see and hear. Next. But at its core, it's knowing what is special about this place and to nurture it and to love it. And knowing it both in the intangible sense, but also in terms of the facts of what's really going on here. It doesn't have to be black and white, like close it down or open it up, but what are the hours and times? What are the times when there's a real pedestrian vehicular set of challenges? And this RFP that's been issued, I think, is going to get at some of those facts. Next. And fundamentally, things that are community-based, things that have a consistent strategy, public space strategy over the time, get you to that critical mass where perceptions start to change and the public space experience starts to change. Next. And the result is, hopefully not this for you, but you know, that you end up with a place that is truly reflective of, you know, the craziness and the beauty of your own spirit in whatever way, that's a little bit different and a little bit crazy, which is what cities are. Next. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. And at this time, I'd like to invite Bartley Keeves from the Winnipeg Free Press to come up to moderate our Q&A portion of the evening. Bartley is reporter at large for the Winnipeg Free Press and the author of 2 books, the Canadian bestseller A Day Tripper's Guide to Manitoba, Exploring Canada's Undiscovered Province, and Stuck in the Middle, Dissenting Views of Winnipeg, a collaboration with photographer Brian Scott, and winner of the 2014 Carol Shields Winnipeg Book Award. Keeves' work has also appeared in media outlets such as The Guardian, CBC Radio, Explore Magazine, and City TV. Bartley.
All right, that was fantastic, all three of you. Now we have about 37 minutes left here. So I had a whole bunch of questions I was going to ask. I'm only going to ask a couple of them because really we would like to hear from you guys first. But very, very quick one, and this is on the top of my head here. Right now, most people in Winnipeg realize, this is for both you, John, and for you, Angela, the city is in the process of working with a private developer, True North Sports Entertainment, to work on a massive public space that will include True North Square. How do we work on that gathering space at the same time that we work on creating a pedestrian space in Portage Main?
you want me to start?
You guys, yep.
All right. Truly one of the questions we had too, like how do we balance urban development? And I would talk about Winnipeg as being not a slow growth, but a moderate growth city, and it's about absorption of spaces. In that capacity, we're looking at how we finance our city a little bit differently. We're using tax increment financing, the uplift on a surface parking lot, and reinvesting that in that place. One of the concerns, and to be frank, we were concerned we didn't want Portage Main left behind. And we have a couple of years to figure out Portage Main, look at those opportunities and those possibilities, and also make it, I think there's a balance for different types of spaces within our downtown. And
Okay. Tax and rent financing, for many of you know this, but basically the future tax dollars that the improved assessment on those buildings gets put back into the area. So, for both of you, if I'm a Portage Main property owner and might be asked to contribute some private funds to the improvement of this intersection and the improvement of the area, why would I say, okay, I'm going to do this when you already, as a city, are devoting funds to a different area?
I'm gonna take it.
You should take that one.
You guys are going to call Councillor Gerbasi over soon.
I noticed Councillor Jabassi left, but sorry, could you just...
Okay, I'll be...
I'll come back to it.
Yeah,
So, the intent is, it's public dollars for public space. We use public dollars to close the intersection because that was the best thinking at that time. If it requires public dollars to reopen the space or do something different in the space or support businesses in our downtown that have been paying taxes for the last 40 years and are good corporate citizens, we need to support them as well. But it's that balance.
Of the 7 Portage Avenue property owners, how many of them were today at the meeting with the property owners?
I would probably have to defer to the BIZ for the exact numbers. Some are tenants, some were direct property owners, some were a combination of
But
both.
not all of them came.
No.
In fact, one big property owner refused to come. And I'm not going to embarrass these people, but how do you then go with, if indeed, as you said earlier, that they can double down on this for another 40 years, until the ocean levels come or whatever, how do you bring them to the table?
We're very upfront. It has to be collaborative. It has to make sense for them. Why would we open up an intersection or change an intersection if it doesn't make common sense? And if it makes common sense, those property owners, those tenants, I think will be supportive. And really it's about having these conversations like we're having tonight, about raising the bar of the discussion from open it, don't open it, to does this make sense? Is it good for retail? Is it good for tenant recruitment and retention? And does it make sense for the citizens and people who work, live, and play in the downtown?
I'm not going to ignore you, Angela, but just moving back over. When you hear the questions I've just asked of John, what kind of advice would you offer to Winnipeg for dealing with the private landowners and also public that is going to focus primarily on, in this city, traffic, cars? What advice would you have for managing the expectations of business owners that don't, property owners that don't even want to come to a meeting at this point?
Well, I mean, in our experience, there were a couple things. One is, some of those concerns, people are not totally irrational. I mean, sometimes some fear is irrational, but sometimes people are like, they really, the small retailers and like the sign owners in our district, when they first closed Broadway, they literally formed a coalition to oppose it because they're like, every single day we have these big trucks that go out that have to service the signs every single day, and there's a lot of signs in Times Square, and then the city said, well, okay, we're going to work with you on this. Even though this was, initially the idea was it's just pedestrians, they said, we're going to let you in there every day until 11 a.m. if you need to go there in service. And so the plan changed in response to some very legitimate concerns. There were other businesses that were very anxious about deliveries. The Broadway theaters were very anxious about a third of their core repeat audience comes by car, whether we like it or not, from the wealthy people from the upper parts of Manhattan or from the outer boroughs. So we had to the plan had to change to respond to that. At the same time, to this day, I said, there's 2/3 to 3/4 to 4/5, depending on who you're talking to, which constituents you're talking to, who like the closing of the plazas. There are some that still hate it, that were important. There's one very important theater owner who just hates it. And he has a right to say, look, I wouldn't have done this, I didn't think it was good. But there was a genuine process of like, we're really going to talk about this. We're really going to see what the majority of people want. And to the extent, like he had some legitimate concerns that grew out of the fact that his father was an elderly person who was not very mobile, and the effect that literally walking to the office out of his car had of the plot that these plazas had. And so there were some, and some turn eliminations that were going to affect that. So the plan changed a little bit. It still didn't satisfy him, but it said, you know what, you've got some legitimate things.
Can you tell us a little bit about the funding model? Where did the money come from? Was it public? Was it private? What was the breakdown?
So at the very beginning, it was really purely public because, as you can see, there was very little money. I mean, we bought the lawn chairs, but that was not a big expense. And then once there was a consensus that this was a really good thing, then the money to actually rebuild the plazas was funded by the city. However, about 2/3 of the cost of that, there was a project in the pipeline where they had to replace these 100-year-old steam and water and pipes underneath the streets, Broadway and 7th Avenue anyway. So the difference, the actual marginal difference was probably about $10 million out of a $30 or $40 million project that actually was about not having asphalt but having nice pavers on top.
Angela,
And when you think about the economic impact, the study we did showed that about 1 in 10 jobs in New York City are indirectly or directly are generated from Times Square. Like, that's a good bang on the buck.
Angela, do you see CentreVenture, or would you see CentreVenture's board supporting some of the funds that you have set aside right now for Portage Main, even though that hasn't been part of your long-term strategic plan? I mean, I know that South Main has, but would you see CentreVenture's funds, which are in essence the city's funds, correct me, please.
Well, they are, yeah.
Yeah, they are. Would you see CentreVenture's funds being devoted to a part of this devoted to this project as part of an overall plan?
You know, our role, you know, even with other types of public space investments that we're working collaboratively with the city on, and say in the East Exchange or in the Shed District, you know, our role is fundamentally, and it's really why I focused my presentation on what I did, was trying to take those public investments and drive them towards private investments. And so you talk about tax and growth financing, where it's much more straightforward. Obviously, with True North Square, it's a $400 million development. It's going to produce quite a bit of taxation, more than the city is going to need to support those public spaces. What I do see happening if Portage Main is opened is I think that that's going to open a lot of opportunities that have really been cut off from development because they're not as integrated into the downtown. And so I think that, you know, our role will be, and it will continue to be, and is to try and capitalize on this opportunity to drive development to benefit from that.
Go ahead.
I just want to add one other point about the private sector. So we're a business improvement district. It's like a BIZ or BIA. Our budget, it's $13 million that's collected from all the property owners. And we are the maintenance partner. So once that gets built, we maintain it and spend a lot of money maintaining it. And this forum is happening because BIZ, you know, organized this conversation, and they're funded by the property owners. So they're playing a key role, and also why they should be at the table. Yeah.
Angela, I took from your conversation and the comments you just made that you primarily see this as a connectivity issue. Do you see development of storefronts or plazas or whatnot around this area? I mean, I'm not asking you to say what will be there. I'm saying, but do you see also gathering space kind of potential here as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think if you walk Portage and Main right now, there's a ton of opportunity. I mean, we don't have the same constrictions even with the space that we have that Times Square does. I mean, the reality is pedestrians drive retail traffic. That's who's buying things in our stores. It's not people, you know, driving through and then suddenly seeing something and stopping and running out and get it. That's not what's happening in our downtown. So I would see that as you're drawing more people in and you're giving them this easy ability to cross, you know, north, south, east, and west through Portage and Main, that's going to create opportunities along some of our main thoroughfares in our downtown that are really undercapitalized right now.
Now, John, you're the head of planning, property, and development. Public Works handles transportation planning. What, on a preliminary basis, have you heard so far about traffic from them?
Well, as we said, 70,000 vehicles move through the intersection in a day. They think there's means by which they can mitigate, move, and I always say traffic's like water. It finds the path of least resistance. And so as I drive home and street repairs occur, I sometimes change my route. We anticipate that there'll be that sort of shaping and flow. And Louis Escobar, who's the manager of our transportation, he attended one of the sessions earlier this morning and came up after and said, you know, I think we could do some things here. And he was starting to sketch things out. So we're out right now to get facts. Right now we all have opinions, but we're going to bring some of those facts to play and to see how we might be able to alter. And I really like Tim's approach of how do we shape it? How do we test things? How do we do things without saying it's going to be this way for another 40 years? But it allows us to tinker with the corner and start to make those incremental changes. And I think they're open to that.
But before I move to the public questions, this request for consultant services, what specific, because many of us are not going to go on to the city's site and read the request for proposals. What specifically, what kind of advice will the city be getting?
It's about getting counts, movement, factors that may influence, and it'll also address some modeling of the corner to see, as we start to make alterations and changes, what that looks like. It has to be, it has to move many types of goods, people through it, but it also has to be safe and it has to be accessible.
Okay, I'm done. Thank you for the question. Sorry I hurried you along, folks.
Okay, thank you.
On behalf of the Downtown BIZ, thank you all so much for this conversation and for coming out tonight. There's certainly been lots of encouraging and inspirational thoughts emerging. And just before we all leave tonight, we'd like to leave you with a few takeaways. Tonight was about conversation and exercising our imaginations, thinking about possibilities and in a collaborative way. Tonight was about placemaking and the possibilities for economic growth with increased pedestrians at Portage Main. By increasing the dwell time that Tim talks about, for pedestrians here, there are so many positive spin-offs towards street-level retail and growing the pie for all in this area. As our downtown grows and develops and evolves more than ever, we need to study movement to think about managing the flow and the choreography of people and vehicles at Portage Main, and helping people to connect above and below grade to other districts, especially for tourists and those living downtown. Let's make sure that as we contemplate changes at Portage Main, we think about good design, and we nurture its distinct and authentic characteristics and celebrate our history, thinking ahead to our dreams and to a future vision for this intersection, giving people a reason to visit this corner. And let's hopefully leave today thinking holistically about Portage Main, and that incremental changes can be a huge opportunity to take a chance to experiment, to do pop-up art displays, events, and at the same time doing surveys and gradually determining together what we want and what will work for this intersection. We just need to undertake consistent, coherent, and strategic interventions over time and to focus on placemaking to make change here at Portage Main and to get it right. So on that note, we really look forward to continuing this dialogue with you. And please visit, if you haven't done so already, the Downtown Winnipeg BIZ website to join the conversation, to get more information. There's lots of information about Portage Main, the designs from the decades, precedent studies from North American cities, and so on. And lastly,
I just want to say one other thing, which I also just want to really acknowledge, John, the being like the sole representative of the city is like also a really hard position to be in, and it's like a big deal to be here and to listen to these big things and to embrace these possibilities of change, because it's, you're answerable to a lot of people beyond the people in this room. So
thank you.
I think we should give them the honor.
And I'd also say, if you have any tax appeals you want, bring them up later. We'll address them as well. So,
Sorry.
But thank you. Yeah.
so on that note, I think we owe one last round of applause to all our special guests here for making the time, and especially to Tim for coming out.